Okay, so I'll get going. I think we've more or less reached quorum. So thanks everyone for registering for our webinar, I should say rather. So we recently launched our report, Smart Prosperity Institute, Species in the Balance, partnering on tools and incentives for recovering Canadian species at risk. And so a bit of background about this report as well as Smart Prosperity Institute. We're a national research network and policy think tank based at the University of Ottawa. We're delivering real world-class research and working with public and private partners, all to advance practical policies and market solutions for a stronger, cleaner economy. And we have a strong research foundation in environmental markets, payments for environmental service schemes, as well as biodiversity offsets. A bit of background about this project in particular. It was funded primarily by the Shad Foundation as well as Earth Rangers, with additional financial support from Environment and Climate Change Canada and the Forest Products Association of Canada. The project is a research partnership between SPI and the Institute of Environment at the University of Ottawa. And so this project had a very interesting rationale. So essentially, Earth Rangers and the Shad Foundation, especially Earth Rangers, raises funds to implement a lot of sort of boots on the ground and in the water conservation activities, and they wanted to get a better sense of where the policy opportunities are for recovering species at risk, and what the policy messages might be. So it was a very interesting partnership, and I think quite timely. And with that in mind, I will just move on ahead and describe the report. So this report canvassed multiple sources of insight, and it was a rather extensive collaboration between Smart Prosperity Institute and the Institute of Environment at U Ottawa. We used an in-depth literature review. We also held a stakeholder workshop and delivered a presentation at a meeting of the Canadian Wildlife Directors Committee. We engaged in semi-structured interviews with over 35 species at risk recovery experts, and we surveyed the views of over 100 species at risk recovery experts and practitioners in the United States, Canada, and Australia. So we really canvassed a wide range of views, and I should say from the outset that the report covers many themes, and for this presentation and webinar, we've decided to hone in on a few key themes, namely the role of economic instruments in recovering species at risk, both on private land and on Crown land, as well as the role of potential new funding sources to increase species at risk conservation funding. I'm not going to spend too much time on these, but population. Okay, I have been told that the internet connection is unstable. Okay. All right, so I think that's been resolved. If anybody encounters any issues, just please let me know, and I'll keep an eye on the chat box. So apologies for that. So anyway, we're fairly familiar with these trends. Approximately 1/3 of reassessed species at risk that have been reassessed by Environment and Climate Change Canada show population trends which are not consistent with recovery strategies. If you broaden that set of imperiled species to also look at species that have been assessed over time by COSEWIC as of special concern, threatened or endangered, then the proportion is considerably higher. So we know there is a need for policy action, and it's an important issue. So that naturally suggests that we have to start looking at some other areas where complementary approaches might be helpful for improving these outcomes. As well, there's a consensus, especially in the recent scientific literature, that the key threats to species at risk include human disturbance, natural systems modification, as well as residential and commercial property development. And then there are other important threats as well, a bit lower on the tiers, such as invasive and problematic species, genes, and diseases, as well as biological resource use, such as harvesting and hunting and the like. Um, so then this is an interesting, this was a recent bit of polling that was done last year, and it finds that Canadians overwhelmingly support action on species at risk and are willing to pay taxes to protect them. So you see in Q1, this is a Likert scale questionnaire, with 1 being the least pro-conservation response, with 5 being the most pro-conservation. And you can see there is an extremely high consensus on the importance of preventing the extinction of species at risk. It's about 89% for those who are in agreement. And then there's also fairly high support for using tax dollars to protect endangered species or to conserve them. But this is where it gets interesting, that support dips, you know, significantly enough if these measures are seen as limiting private property rights. And to a lesser extent, there's also a problem, sorry. To some extent, there's also a dip in support on the need to, if there's a need to limit industrial development. So in both these cases, it suggests that more collaborative models are needed between all stakeholders, so federal, provincial, and territorial governments, as well as ENGOs, because there's also been case studies which have shown that that measures on private land can be, if they're directly regulatory or seen as too intrusive, can also be met with hostility. So there needs to be a sort of dialogue and outreach with landowners and other stakeholders on this. So just to review some of the challenges, we examine others in the report, but some of the key ones pertaining to the themes we're exploring in this webinar. You know, almost all parties have conceded that there is room for improvement in improving recovery outcomes and in terms of the amount of resources that can be allocated to species at risk recovery. We know that there are potentially significant gaps in species at risk protection on non-federal land due to the limited scope of protections for terrestrial species, with a few exceptions with the backstop mechanisms in the legislation. But the long and short of it is that the federal government needs to work collaboratively with provincial and territorial governments who have different legislative frameworks for managing species at risk and wildlife, and who have broader conservation mandates. And then, of course, we also know that involving private landowners in SAR conservation recovery is essential. Both because many species at risk have habitat on agricultural land and other private land, and also because we know that many threats to species at risk are originating in private land as well. So again, a collaborative approach, providing incentives and other sort of legislative tools are really essential to move forward on this file. And then we also saw from our interviews and the survey and the like that there's a sense that policymakers are using a somewhat narrow set of tools. You know, despite interest amongst the community of SARA practitioners and experts, there's relatively little use of complementary tools such as place-based approaches, multi-species and ecosystem approaches, or economic instruments. So we have here just an example of some polling data, or not polling rather, but survey data that we got for the Species at Risk survey, and we found that you know, there's a very strong perception that species at risk conservation and recovery outcomes from complementary tools such as place-based approaches and economic instruments would be considerably improved. So that's quite heartening. As you can see, so from the purple bar in the lower right-hand corner, the improvement, there's a pretty high consensus amongst all 3 major stakeholder groups, namely government, industry, and ENGOs. On the other hand, we also find that Canadian respondent perceptions of the overall public support for species at risk policy and programs is quite high if these complementary tools were to be used more frequently. So with a bit of a caveat that in, I guess, the case of government, the government respondents did not necessarily see a major change, either increase or decrease in public support for species at risk recovery through the use of place-based approaches. But when it came to economic instruments, there was a strong consensus from all parties that this could potentially increase public support. So, we know there's an interest and an appetite for using these tools, but it's a question of um, scaling up the appropriate tools as well as piloting where we still want to find our way on some tools and things like and the like. One other major finding concerns resource constraints. There was a very significant consensus amongst respondents that many of the resources currently devoted towards implementing the species at risk right now are allocated to the front end. So thinking of listing and related consultations, as well as drafting recovery strategies, which are of course incredibly important activities. But there is a sense that far too resources are currently being devoted to action plans, as well as implementing recovery actions and stewardship. There was also a fairly strong recognition of the importance of additional funding from both government and ENGO stakeholders. So we have, again, on the right, some of the survey data. And so this is Canadian respondents' ranking of the most desired factor for improving species at risk outcome, and we have the different organization types. You can see there's a strong plurality in the case of government respondents that additional resources would be the most desired factor for improving outcomes. There's also a pretty strong plurality for additional resources in the ENGO community. It's the second highest, or the second most frequently stated number one factor. And then on the other hand, though, industry listed a bit lower. And the other major message that we saw pretty consistently, especially across industry and ENGOs, is that political will and stakeholder support are another major requirement for success, which actually dovetails with some of the other recommendations and some of the other findings of our report. So that's also quite interesting. And so, the perception is that more resources could be allocated, and there's also independent lines of evidence which illustrate just how important conservation spending is. There's studies of the U.S. Endangered Species Act which show that increased per species spending slows the decline of listed species. And then there was, for another illustrative example, a recent global study published in Nature found that the increased spending on endangered bird and mammal conservation since the Earth Summit reduced median per country species loss of these endangered species by 29%. So unfortunately, they didn't have an estimate for Canada in that study, but it still just shows that there is a real significant potential for additional resources to improve recovery outcomes. And we also found in the report, we provided a very rough estimate of comparison of per capita federal, provincial, and territorial species at risk expenditures compared to the federal and state expenditures on endangered species conservation in the United States. And we find that it's around, or it may be around 60 to 70% per capita. So even if we're just trying to ensure that we're keeping parity with other countries that have similar socioeconomic contexts and land use contexts, it shows that there's room for additional funding. And then, this also suggests that an exploration of different funding tools would be helpful, because we know that in some cases, especially subnational jurisdictions, are facing some significant fiscal challenges. So trying to explore the different approaches to funding SAR conservation could be quite helpful in that regard. So the solutions, we're going to be going into these one by one, so I'll just quickly go through these as an overview. Our major recommendation is to harness a suite of economic instruments for recovering species at risk. These include a permit and offset system for Crown land, both federal, provincial, and territorial, protecting critical habitat on private land, as well as addressing non-habitat threats to species at risk. And then the other one, of course, is recognizing the need for increasing funding for species at risk conservation. And we'll quickly delve into a few options, such as municipal referenda for local property tax increases, a small share of carbon pricing revenues, as well as sovereign and sub-sovereign green bonds. Oops, sorry. So just to back up very quickly and to give a quick discussion of economic instruments, there's several studies which have already shown that Canada makes relatively little use of economic instruments for wildlife conservation compared to peer countries, and that hopefully we would like to see this change. Currently the species at risk stewardship programs largely consist of extension and cost share activities, and while there are many cases where these programs do work quite well, or the cost share and extension activities, We do think expanding the scope to include economic instruments and to compensate landowners for the opportunity costs of species at risk conservation is an important opportunity. So for a number of reasons, one of them, and so moving on to potential benefits for economic instruments, the first among these is, by providing a compensation for the opportunity costs of perhaps some more costly or labor-intensive measures, such as ecological restoration or taking certain parcels of land out of production, or perhaps reducing the intensity of land use. Providing a compensation for the opportunity cost may encourage conservation activities at greater scale, because essentially there may well be limits to what voluntary measures can achieve through extension, as well as measures that only cover, program and construction and installation costs, such as cost sharing activities. Second, economic instruments can also provide incentives for continuous improvement in management practices. It may be more challenging to do that through the other more conventional approaches I mentioned earlier. Through proper targeting and through instrument design, you can improve the cost effectiveness relative to more traditional regulatory approaches. And then finally, some instruments can also potentially provide revenue for further conservation efforts. So you could think of tax on point source pollution sources, or alternatively, perhaps on agricultural inputs or whatnot. And while, of course, there is a trade-off that needs to be examined in how you're using those proceeds, because possibly recycling the revenues back to landowners or industry could increase the political acceptability of these schemes, they are another potential benefit for from the use of these instruments. So to sort of dive into a few of them in a little more detail, in terms of permits and offsets, the federal government had a proposed federal permit and offsets policy, which we think could provide a very helpful template for provincial and territorial governments once the details are finalized and some issues are clarified. There are several attractive aspects of the policy as it stands, namely a rigorous adherence, or an intention to rigorously adhere to the mitigation hierarchy. So as we see to the diagram on the right, you have the projected impact in the purple bar. The blue dash or blue bar is the avoided impacts from measures that are taken to avoid impacts to biodiversity and species at risk. Then you would have mitigation measures, which are meant to lessen the impact further. And that's the dark turquoise or dark blue bar. And then finally, the green and gray measures are through offsetting measures. So ideally, habitat or residence restoration, enhancement, creation, and so on, which creates a net positive impact. And so this is the second aspect, which we're very encouraged to see in the policy, is that offsets must ensure a net gain to SAR, which is to say that the compensation measures or their expected benefits must exceed the expected harm or the likely harm due to to SAR due to the project going through. And then it also allows banking to reward early action, which can increase the likelihood of success. There have been several studies which suggest that restoration measures taken in advance are more likely to achieve the no net loss goal. So drilling down into a bit more of the finer details, we do think that some clarity would help ensure that the approach is rigorously managing risks. So first of all, in some cases, you just need to recognize that there are limits to what can be offset. Certain kinds of ecosystems cannot necessarily have their structure and function restored based on current knowledge. As we said earlier, encouraging banking and early action is quite positive. I think possibly more thinking is needed on ensuring that there's enough of a market. It could potentially be a very thin market, so that requires some thinking, but it's still an important precedent. We're also recommending that policymakers use rigorous and consistent multipliers to adjust for time lags and for risks, so that if it will take 20 years for the restoration project to reach the reference state of the habitat, for instance, then we think that there should be a compound interest rate, for want of a better word, or multiplier for each year to adjust for that time lag. And there should also be a separate multiplier for risks. And this would also help incentivize early action insofar as a project that was undertaken, a restoration project that was undertaken 5 or 10 years earlier, would then face a lower multiplier for a project say a development project, it would have a lower multiplier for compensation measures if it were to purchase those credits. So there'd be a higher ecological gain from the get-go. So that's another way of encouraging the early action. Then this is also important. It was suggested by our colleague, Dr. Finley, who also made a number of important contributions to the report, namely that regulators should consider penalizing projects which underperform on their predicted mitigation and compensation measures. So the idea would be that if they predict a certain effect from their mitigation measures and in fact they underperform, or say it's only 2/3 of the estimated mitigation impact actually accrues, then in that case they would be penalized by either a higher multiplier that would be needed for restoration and offset measures, or alternatively they'd have to engage in alternative threat remediation measures. So this would help incentivize accuracy in predictions in terms of the mitigation effects. So we think that's quite important. And then finally, there's a need to monitor and learn lessons. We've seen previously in some cases that habitat banking programs do not necessarily achieve the no net loss goal due to the fact that there have been some shortcomings in monitoring for compliance and enforcement and effectiveness. So we do think there's a real opportunity to improve management outcomes, but the design needs to be done right in order to do so. And of course, then this is a federal policy. So what we would like to see as well is some bridging factors to ensure similarly stringent offsets are in place throughout the country. So there's a couple of different mechanisms that we discuss in the report that could do so. One of them would be for the provinces and territories to implement mirror permitting and offset policies. This might be challenging though because of the fact that in some cases the legislation isn't structured in the same way as the Species at Risk Act, so it might complicate the way that permits and offsets are structured. So, and in some cases, some of the measures are discretionary in some of the legislation and regulations in the provinces and territories. So another important opportunity would be to use signed Section 11 agreements as the basis for an offset instead between the federal government as well as provincial and territorial governments. So still more work to be done in this area, but we do think it is a promising precedent. In terms of protecting habitat on private land, I thought I'd give a brief overview of some promising initiatives or pilots and why we think that these have real potential for recovering species at risk on private land. There's been a lot of work done with research done on easements, and it suggests that they are an effective SAR conservation tool on private land. So just give one example, there was a modeling study for which examined the impact of 100 million in targeted easement investments in the Midwestern and Northwestern US. And the study results suggested this could reduce potential future losses of sage grouse on farmland by around 80%, with approximately only around 1% of the remaining sage grouse population remaining vulnerable to agricultural expansion and intensification. There's another study, an empirical study done in Manitoba, which found or seems to find that land with high suitability for waterfowl habitat was more likely to be targeted for easements since they have habitat suitability models in some cases. And then there's also been suggestions from the states and Canadian evidence that easements are successfully targeting agricultural land that's at risk of conversion. So it's actually achieving additionality and net gain, an actual gain to species at risk. So that's important to make sure that you're actually targeting land that has conservation value and is at risk of threat. You need to keep your eye on both of those factors. And then there's some payment-free ecological service schemes that are being piloted in Canada, for instance, by the Alternative Land Use Services in Ontario. And we think these are a little more early days, but there's some promise insofar as research has found that in some cases, there's some reluctance to adopt permanent conservation easements. So a sort of suite of temporary measures might be needed to encourage landowner participation. So not only temporary conservation easements, but as well pest schemes and the like. So that's an interesting area to keep an eye on. In terms of some general lessons, the first is quite important, is namely that the schemes need to be explicitly targeted to ensure value for money. And you should be trying to target the landowners with the best potential, either for creating or protecting existing habitat or for abating threats to species at risk. And while that does sound on one level obvious, at the same time, there, in some cases, it's the participation in a program is seen as a key indicator for success. And in some cases, a scheme that maximizes participation might actually have a bit of a lower conservation benefit. So, you need to be making sure that you're investing appropriately and targeting on the front end. At the same time, we realize that investing in targeting instruments or in mechanisms such as reverse auctions can create transaction costs, and it can sometimes be quite complex then for farmers to adopt, or alternatively, it might be costly for land trusts to implement, and so on. So we recognize there needs to be a trade-off between flexibility and the simplicity of the design of the program and the instruments to encourage participation, and sometimes it means also flexibility in terms of, the permanence of the easement or of the conservation measures. But on the other hand, you need some level of rigor. So it's essentially ensuring that you're targeting, but making it flexible enough to ensure critical mass of participation, because if you don't get enough participation, you won't be getting the targeted level of environmental benefit to begin with. We also think that there are some interesting precedents being set and some tools to explore that could potentially lower program costs. So I already mentioned reverse auctions, where you try to specify a target level of benefits for species at risk. It could be habitat or residence enhancement, and then you get different landowners to submit their bids competitively to try to identify the lowest cost actions. There's also revolving restoration funds, which are being implemented by groups such as Ducks Unlimited Canada, which purchase, say, agricultural property, implement grassland restoration initiatives, secure that property with an easement, and then resell the land with an online auction. And in some cases, they're able to recoup their costs or potentially even make a bit of money. So that's also a very interesting approach that we think could still, as well, worth considering in the toolkit. And then finally, this one is quite cross-cutting, but more work needs to be done, honestly, to adopt an experimental or quasi-experimental approach to SAR conservation. So more work needs to be done either to create control groups for some of these programs, or alternatively to set some kind of baseline data in terms of threats of agricultural conversion or land use conversion, and so on. And then finally, another area to explore would be to find ways to opt landowners in quite easily into conservation easements. Sorry, not conservation easements, I beg your pardon, Section 11 agreements. So if a landowner were either donating a property under the Eco Gifts program or signing a conservation easement, making it rather easy, adding only a few additional requirements for them to easily opt into a Section 11 agreement, which would then enhance the likelihood that it'd be seen as protecting SAR habitat on non-federal land. So, lots of interesting precedents there. And so then moving on to the funding tools, as we said, there is a real need for funding for species at risk and to increase that funding. And so there's a lot of appetite for exploring different ways that additional finances could be raised. So one example that we are quite interested, or that we think is quite promising, are local referenda for local bonds and property tax increases, with the proceeds being allocated to species at risk or other wildlife conservation and green space conservation. You can find in the United States, for instance, this has been quite widespread over the last few decades, and that approximately $76 billion in bonds and taxes has been raised for land conservation in the States over the past 30 years, which is quite impressive. And it's also, from my understanding, these initiatives have been also, fairly successful in red states where there may be a little more reticence to tax increases. So it just shows that it can have quite a cross-partisan appeal, and that even though in some cases there might be some opposition to the idea of a property tax increase, it's not necessarily insurmountable. We see that there are some Canadian initiatives that have also taken leadership on this front, such as the the Capital Regional District, the Regional District of East Kootenay, as well as the Regional District of Similkameen, apologies. And then we found, just since we were speaking about the politics of these measures, even though this is ostensibly, or if it's meant largely to be about wildlife conservation, you still need to create a broad coalition of interest for these to be successful. So if you see in the States, a lot of the time it's these broad coalitions between the hunting and sporting communities, some cases natural heritage communities, health and community development benefits, recreational folks interested in more recreational dimensions, as well as the environmentalists. So it's trying to create a broad coalition of interests. So in addition to Saarland, trying to fund a mix of sort of green space and recreational uses for the land, and then also trying to communicate the full suite of potential recreational, environmental, and health benefits that these measures would be used and put towards. Okay, so then carbon pricing revenues is also quite important. I mean, we recognize that these are provincial schemes, and that either in some cases the province is directly implementing the carbon price, or alternatively it is the money from the federal government will be abated, rather rebated back to the provinces. But we do think there's still a major opportunity for the federal government to say that they are committing greater resources to species at risk recovery, and that they expect the provincial governments to do so, and that the carbon price is actually a very viable means of generating this additional funding. A lot of the political capital has already been expended into implementing the carbon price and designing it, and to ensuring the buy-in. And it would not necessarily be a large carve-out for SAR conservation to have a very considerable impact. I mean, for instance, devoting half a percentage point to SAR species at risk conservation from the carbon pricing proceeds in, say, 2022 would raise tens of millions in additional funding for species at risk. You know, it could even potentially match current federal funding for species at risk implementation. And then even if we wanted to communicate it more as if we wanted to communicate a more tight link with climate action as well, we could state that there are multiple benefits related to climate change, for instance, carbon sequestration, as well as enhancing climate change adaptation and resilience, as well as other benefits that are quite important to many Canadians, such as improving water quality. I should note, I motored through because I realize that we're going a bit over time, the non-habitat measures. So I'm going to just finish with this last slide on green bonds. We do think that there is a significant potential for exploring sovereign and sub-sovereign green bonds for recovering species at risk. For instance, we saw last year that a combined 1.3 million in green bonds have been issued by the governments of Quebec and Ontario. The proceeds of these bonds were largely devoted to low carbon infrastructure and related issues. So right now they're very much in the climate bond space, but we do think there are some very interesting and exciting opportunities to issue bonds for biodiversity or for species of risk more particularly. One clear case where there's a fitness for purpose would be to finance capital intensive habitat acquisition and restoration activities. So for instance, there was a recent proposal to the government of Alberta to issue about 100 million worth of green bonds to provide the needed funding for both habitat restoration measures as well as establishing a caribou breeding facility. And we do think there could be some interesting opportunities as well to potentially lower the cost of these bonds or find new ways of financing them through either niche markets, so finding retail investors who are willing to accept a slightly lower interest rate on the bond because they want to provide a bit of concessional financing for biodiversity conservation, or alternatively, in some cases where if you can clearly identify that some species at risk conservation activities lead to cost savings relative to the status quo, or for instance, if you're able to show that habitat acquisition and restoration over the long run, or at least provide compelling evidence that these measures over the long run would save costs relative to, say, a captive breeding program, if the cost savings are large enough, you can potentially monetize those cost savings and make that the basis of the payout for the bond. So, I mean, these are some sort of embryonic areas that are worth further exploring. But even if you can't get the niche markets or the monetization of cost savings, it's still well worth exploring, given that the overall size of the debt issuance for something like biodiversity species at risk bonds would probably be a sliver compared to other green bonds or just conventional bond issuance. So either way, we think it's an area that both sovereign and sub-sovereign jurisdictions or governments rather, should well worth explore. And then finally, I'll just note, there are several other measures that we identify for raising different revenues, and we also just try to show that there is some support in the report for increasing just traditional program government expenditures. So, there are multiple options in which we could ostensibly or potentially fund a species at risk agenda, and that to conclude, we appreciate that the challenges facing species at risk recovery are quite considerable, but we do think that through a combination of determination and ingenuity and partnership with many different stakeholders who want to see these species recovered, that there are potentials for major gains through different policy and legislative tools, and that hopefully our grandchildren will thank us for that, and that we will be able to find the funding and the political will to meet the need. So with that, I thank you for your time and open the floor for questions. Thanks. Now I understand that Matthias will be moderating the Q&A. I'll just zoom in and then stop share. Here we go. Okay, everyone. And so essentially, I will be taking a look at the participants that have their hands up. If I'll call in Matthias if I need some help on that front. So right now I see that Lynn Campbell has a question. Thanks for that, Lynn. If you don't mind, I'll just answer verbally. So yeah, we actually do discuss natural resource royalties in the report. It's similar to the carbon price insofar as a small fraction could actually raise substantial funds, at least provincially and territorially, for species at risk conservation. And we do think there is a rather compelling rationale as well, given that the direct links between natural resource extraction, processing, and transportation on the one hand, and impacts to species at risk on the other, that there is a compelling narrative, and in certain cases it is an opportunity. Then the question is it that you're earmarking a share of existing royalties, or is it rather sorry, question came up. Yeah, either is it a question of raising the royalty rate, or is it just allocating existing royalty revenues? I mean, that's a trickier question because of how that would deal with the willingness to invest. But even there, we think there are some opportunities. Probably would have to be packaged as part of a larger discussion on royalty reforms and the like. But yeah, definitely, we think that's quite important. And then I see, yeah, Louise Blight has a question. Yes, the references for the presentation are cited in the report, and we're happy to make them available. In fact, I can circulate this afterwards, but we have I also have them at the end of the presentation itself. So I can circulate in all likelihood the slide deck to participants, and we can go from there. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to discuss. Anyone else? I'm looking to see the hands up. Okay, so we have Mike Gilbert. Regarding public willingness to pay taxes to address SAR issues, did the research address thresholds of resistance? Do you have a microphone, Mike? I think I understand what you are saying, but is it is it you're saying that you know, the resistance, it has a gradation depending on the rate of taxation, or is it rather I guess if maybe you've just sent that message. Okay, yeah. No, we didn't quite get into that level of detail, but I do think it is an important issue. But no, that was not at the level of detail we looked at in the report. Right. Okay. And then I saw that yeah, sorry, Serge Villeneuve. Did you have any discussion with Canada's Ecofiscal Commission on the tool? Are you Which tools or tool are you referring to? The carbon pricing proceeds, or are you referring to the economic instruments for the land use, or? Oh, sorry, Serge, one moment. I'll unmute you. I didn't know your microphone was Serge Villeneuve.
Can you?
Oh yeah,
Can you
there we
hear
go.
me?
Yeah, sorry about that, Mr. Villeneuve.
So can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you,
Okay.
Mr.
So, well, I'm referring to any kind of tools. I guess where I want to get at is to know if they had any advice to say on funding where you could get some funding for the different tools.
No, so I mean, we kept EcoFiscal in the loop on this report, but we didn't have a formal sit-down discussion on funding tools with them. However, the paper was reviewed by 2 economists, however, so we have had some of those considerations integrated into the review of the paper and the report.
All right, thanks.
Sure. Okay, Stephen?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, my question is dealing with loss of public lands. I'm from Saskatchewan, and we're losing our PFRA pastures and a lot of our community pastures. And I was wondering what effect that will have on SAR conservation and the ability to be able to look after vulnerable habitats.
Because if I understand you correctly, the land is becoming privatized, or?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, sorry, I can't pretend to provide a definitive answer, but to me, I suppose it would depend on the sort of land uses that are being planned for the parcels that are, moving out of a public ownership, and as well as, are there any easements or any other measures that will be secured to either encourage or prohibit certain kinds of land uses or certain kinds of management practices, so that even if it is no longer under public ownership, are there measures being taken in place to ensure that the species are being appropriately managed? So I mean, I suppose it really depends on the context in which they're being privatized.
Okay, thank you.
So I guess the short answer is, to me, it's not, the ownership category would not concern me as much as it is the sort of prohibitions, prescriptions, and the types of management practices that are in place.
And whether land owners will follow those practices.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Of course. That being okay. The sort of ancillary clause, I guess.
Okay. Thank you, and I'm really enjoying this. So thanks.
Thank you. Okay, lots of messages. I apologize. I'm going to try to get through all of them. I see Irwin Driessen. Apologies if I mispronounced that. Ontario is handing out net benefit permits by the dozen with no apparent accountability or even credibility of the benefits. How can they improve this program? To me, it's a couple of issues. It's first, I should say, I don't pretend to be an expert on Ontario's net benefits policy, so I will tread carefully. But to me, it's essentially a couple of things. One, what are the are they adhering to the mitigation hierarchy? When they say a net benefit, what is the sort of ratio that they're using to compensate for impacts to the land or to the habitat, as well as what sort of monitoring provisions are in place. So I mean, these are essential design issues that would be of most interest to me when looking at such a program. I don't want to comment on the particulars too much, and I suppose this is one thing I should have flagged from the get-go, is the report does touch on provincial territorial issues, but we largely focused on federal policy due to the unique structure of and role of the Species at Risk Act, as well as the Federal Provincial Accord for Species at Risk. So anyway, but I would be interested perhaps in discussing that with you bilaterally sometime. And then we have Lynn Campbell. So in BC, for some, they did referendums prior to implementing local conservation funds, i.e. with parcel tax increases. They did for implementing local. Yeah. Sorry, Lynn, do you have a microphone, or I just want to make sure I understand you correctly. Hi, Lynn. Okay.
Hi, we're in a big room, actually. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, yeah, perfect.
There's quite a few. No, I was just trying to give your examples of the local conservation funds that you'd mentioned in the PowerPoint was really great. And thank you, by the way, for your talk. There's a lot of us that work on a lot of the work you've covered in your talk today, so it's great. We're all kind of on the same page, which is always good to hear. But no, I was just answering, I think, I don't know exactly what Mike was asking earlier, but I don't know exact thresholds, but local governments have done an amazing job with NGOs in BC, probably because we are completely devoid of stewardship funds for them in the province. And so, when there is a need, people will build, right, I guess. So they, in some cases, I don't know how much you looked into it or how much Mike knows about them, but, in some cases, they had to do referendums to ensure there was that public support, and the local governments really required that. So I was just trying to follow up on that one.
Yeah. So sorry, that maybe I didn't make that as clear as I should have, so I apologize. In most cases, yeah, these measures are preceded by referenda, or maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying, Lynn.
No, yeah, that's good. I think, Mike was just Mike's question. It was Mike's question earlier that asked, did the research address thresholds to resistance? And I mean, in BC, I think what's been really helpful too is the sort of more focused provincial-based public opinion polls and stuff. But when you want to actually do something like a parcel tax, like the CRD or the other regional districts that have done them, then trying to get that public support's pretty key. That's all.
Wonderful. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure, that it's sensitive to scope. If it's a doubling of their property tax, there might not be quite as much enthusiasm, but they're interesting initiatives, and I'm sure there's a deeper dive could have teased out even further lessons learned, but this is really exciting, and that there should be more of these conversations across the country on this type of measure.
Yeah, they only are $10 or $20, depending on the area, per parcel tax per year. So it's like nothing. And then there's another really cool example for those of you not in BC called NAPTEP. I don't know if you heard about the Natural Area Tax NAPTEP, Natural Area Protection Tax Exemption Program through the Islands Trust Fund, which is another cool area where it's a tax shifting model where it's revenue neutral, so that people that have conservationally important lands have a tax break for that portion of their land. And then the other landowners pay a very, very small increase. They don't even notice on their parcel tax. So that's something that BC is looking into trying to possibly expand to other areas of the province, but it's very complicated because it involves tax reform or law reform. So
yeah, some of these things, do get tricky, as I discovered very early on in this project. Anybody else? Matthias, who's our tech support staff, let me know if I'm missing somebody as well. I'm trying to look for some hands up. Oh, two more. Hang on. Are you able to unmute us? Certainly. Let me talk to. Let me see, Louise. Hello, Louise.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Oh, great. Yeah, one of the things I wanted to say was I think these are great examples, and it concerns me that people could just leap into them enthusiastically without thinking about some of the potential drawbacks, because I know for payments for ecological services, for example, in the States, for some bird projects, they've been finding some drawbacks to them, and people trying to lure at-risk species to their property, for example, so they can get paid for them, which is not good for the individuals or the species in question. So I guess part of the answer to that is monitoring and learning from mistakes, and then monitoring always gets left out of these sorts of things. So maybe as you promote these kind of approaches, it would be important for you to really emphasize the need to learn from what's being done and to monitor and so on to avoid those drawbacks or to learn from them when they happen.
Sure. So you're actually getting at 2 or 3 things that I find very interesting in there. And one of them is, yeah, you have to be, careful to make sure you're not designing a program that'll achieve perverse outcomes by, luring them to the property, in which case they may actually be put more at risk depending on the cases, right? So, I mean, definitely, maybe we didn't drill this quite home enough in the webinar, but I do think we drill it in the report quite a bit, is that design of these matters. There are ways to get them right and they're wrong, and they're not magic silver bullets. I mean, you have to make sure you're targeting the right kinds of conservation actions or the right threat remediation actions, and you have to be definitely baking better baseline information into the cake when you're designing these programs and projects. Everything, from my understanding, is that you're saying is music to my ears.
Great. Glad to hear it's in the report.
Anyone else? Let's see. Sean Lemoyne, one moment. Hello, Sean? Oh, sorry. Sean?
Yes.
Okay, I understood that you had raised your hand.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. If you able to see the question, or?
No, or maybe I have to scroll up. There's quite a few. Oh, here we go. Have aspects of existing payment schemes. Some aspect of carbon share contribute to the conversion of knowledge. Perhaps look at the source code. Have aspect. One moment. I haven't seen that for myself, but that definitely sounds intriguing. I'd love to talk to you about this sometime. So have aspects. No, I have not seen that. Personally, though, it may well be that I just didn't look in the right places.
Okay, there's some papers out there that seem to like a growing amount of research that suggests that some of the crop insurance programs can contribute to cropping or conversion of marginal lands, whether it's like wet areas or wetlands. And looking at those insurance programs, there's existing funds already contributing. Decoupling those from the existing programs and using them towards conservation measures. You know, arguably, you've got a fund that's already in existence or dollars that are already available, but instead of competing against conversion activities or conservation activities, you're actually using that to further support activities.
Yeah, I've seen some interesting work on some of the the environmental implications of agricultural support programs. I haven't seen that those studies in particular, but that does sound quite interesting. I mean, it raises some broader discussions on whether cross compliance should be considered for these types of programs and the like.
It would be a big conversation with Ag Food Canada as well.
I know.
Yeah, but I think the potential would be there.